Now let's examine configuring SMTP auth. We've shown you how to set up basic relaying using the main.cf file. And the default again is to relay the subdomain or the subnet that the particular postfix host is connected to physically. So it'll relay for itself, it'll relay any subdomains and domains that it serves as a relay destination for, and it'll also relay for any matching subnets. So our system, by executing an if config, is a member of the subnet 192.168.1. So any member of this subnet will be able to relay through our host unless we change the policy. But let's show you how to enable SMTP auth, because this is a useful way of permitting roaming users to relay through your server. For example, if you have users who roam who connect through various ISPs or even through static ISPs but whose IP addresses are subject to change, such as connections from cable or DSL providers, SMTP auth functions as a way to authenticate the user and not necessarily the IP address or the machine. By default, postfix isn't configured with SMTP auth, and you can tell by simply connecting to the local port 25, providing that postfix is up and running. Let's open a separate shell. We'll telnet to localhost port 25. Postfix responds and will send an extended hello message, which is done using the elo command for extended hello, and we'll identify ourselves as localhost. This will return the features that the MTA supports, including pipelining, verify, ETRN, 8-bit MIME, and so on. What you do see missing, or what you don't see, is the auth response, indicating the support for SMTP auth and its various mechanisms. SMTP auth supports various mechanisms for authentication, ranging from plain and clear text to encrypted Kerberos support, as well as digest and cram MD5. The general suggestion is, if you're going to use login or plain authentication mechanisms for relaying, you should also use transport layer security, or TLS. However, we're going to show you how to configure initially SMTP auth with login and plain support to support our Outlook Express client in this particular Windows, on this particular Windows system. So let's close this session that's currently tied to port 25, and we'll return to a shell. Now there are a few things that we need to do. We need to recompile postfix to support the SMTP auth protocol. But before we do so, we need to confirm that certain packages have already been installed on the system. And we're searching for the Cirrus SASL libraries, the simple authentication libraries. Let's RPM query all, grep Cirrus. Cirrus is the standard library supported within Linux for supporting SMTP authentication. It can also provide authentication for other means, other applications. Cirrus runs in the background as a daemon, and it accepts requests from SendMail or Postfix or any other MTA that supports SMTP auth, and it provides a service on behalf of the MTA. It queries either PAM, which is the pluggable authentication module, or the etc shadow file and etc password files directly to authenticate the user. Now we've already pre-installed all of the various authentication mechanisms. SUSE Enterprise Linux provides various packages for the various authentication mechanisms, digest MD5 and so on. The main program is Cirrus SASL version 2.1.x. We also need a development package, because when recompiling postfix, we'll need to specify the location of the header files that are provided by the development package. So ensure on your system, whether you're running SUSE, Red Hat, Debian, and so on, that you have the base Cirrus SASL, preferably version 2.x, as well as the development package, as well as one or more authentication mechanisms, which are usually provided by separate packages. If not, you can always download from Carnegie Mellon the entire Cirrus package, compile it, and compile in, using the configure command, the mechanisms that you'd like to support. So now we know that we have this on the system, let's actually navigate into the postfix home directory where we compiled the original build. So let's go to Linux CBT SUSE1 into postfix. And here's the top of the source tree. What we should do to clean up any traces of our prior work is to run or execute make tidy. This is postfix's way of cleaning up any traces of object files that were built as a result of the compilation process. After the make tidy, we then need to actually rerun make, but we're going to pass in a few key configuration options. What we're going to do here is equivalent to running configure for other packages, but since postfix gets or executes directly from the make command, it skips the configure step. It combines or collapses both steps into the make process. We'll just do it from the make process. Now this can be found in the postfix documentation, so you don't need to memorize what we're going to type. So we'll execute a make files, and we're going to specify some key arguments including cc arguments, and cc args will make it equal to what we'll specify here, including use SASL, and we want to use SASL auth. We'll need to specify the location of the include files. On our system, they're located in user include SASL. You don't need to memorize this. If you RPM query list on your Cirrus packages, you'll see that the include files, especially the development package, the include files have been stored in user include SASL. We also need to include auxiliary libraries, and these are the actual libraries that are in user lib. We'll just simply reference here user lib, and the name of the library is SASL version 2, so SASL 2. So this will do it for the make process. We're including the usage of SSL auth, and we can locate, or we're instructing the make process to find the include files in user include SASL, and the library itself can be found in user lib, and we're telling postfix, no differently than with sendmail, to find the library in user lib, and the name of the library is actually SASL version 2 or SASL 2. Let's execute this. This takes a little bit to run, and once we've recompiled, we can then do or execute a make install. So there it is. We have it run. It actually just ran through the process. This is the new make, and providing that we haven't specified anything wrong on the command line, like any missing quotes or directives, we should be okay. Again, both packages need to be installed. Now before we execute the make install, what we want to do is actually execute postfix stop. We want to stop the current running version of the MTA, and then we'll run or execute make install. This will prompt us, and now you actually see the compilation going through with the inclusion of SASL auth and the include directory being user include SASL. It'll prompt us eventually, as it did in the initial build, to specify the root, the home directory, or the directory for the postfix configuration files, the directory for postfix's backend daemons, including the queue manager, the master file, and the rest of them, the cleanup daemon, the trivial rewrite daemon, the smtpd daemon, as well as the smtp client, etc. All of the source files are being built currently, as you can see, traces of, or with the inclusion of SASL auth. Now we're at the stage that looks familiar. We'll skip this step, and the temp directory will just be a subdirectory of this user's home directory for writing scratch files, which make tidy cleans up. The config directory, this is where the configuration files will be stored. Now the existing main.cf will not be overwritten, so anything we've done to this point will still be preserved. The daemon directory, user lib exec postfix, this varies from system to system. So if you're following along on a different system, perhaps on a Red Hat or Debian based system, you may see user lib postfix. Just go along with the default. Perhaps at one point or another you had a package installed, or a postfix package installed, which placed its files in a different location. The postfix compatible sendmail binary, new aliases, mail queue, who owns the mail, the set GID group for local submissions, and this is the location of the HTML files, man pages, no readmes, and then these files will be copied. Now the last step, similar to compilation in sendmail, if you're with us from the sendmail disk or sendmail version, is to actually include support in the main.cf file. In sendmail we actually include support in sendmail.mc. Well, for postfix, let's navigate into etc postfix, and we'll need to update the main.cf file. Now we can execute a postconf, and we can dump to the screen all of the variables, or we can simply grep for the variables, the key value pairs that we're interested in. We're interested in two key value pairs. The first is smtpd SASL. We'll just grep for this particular string. We're going to change SASL auth enable from no to yes. And the next string is smtpd recipient restrictions, which currently isn't set. We're going to set this particular, or in fact we do have it set, so we're going to alter it so that it becomes permit my networks as well as permit SASL as well as reject. Now we haven't looked at the way we can reduce or the number of junk messages and tightly control relaying through our system using the SMTPD access policies of Postfix, but just know that Postfix supports SMTPD or SMTP based policies, access policies. And by defining an SMTPD recipient restrictions policy, we're essentially telling Postfix or instructing Postfix to permit or deny relaying to certain destinations based on whatever is specified in the policy. So in this particular policy, the default policy, permit my networks, permits anyone who's a member of our network, which is specified by the my networks directive, which includes, of course, any recipient to or any sender from any of the IP addresses that we're a member of, whether it's local, the local host, the local subnet, or the 192.168.1 subnet, and so on, to relay to any recipient. And otherwise, we reject if you're not coming from our subnet. So we need to stick in here in this stream the permission of SASL. So those are the only two directives. So let's actually modify main.cf, and we'll find the first directive, which is smtpd SASL auth enable. Now, as you can see, it doesn't come up, and if it doesn't come up, that means it's not declared. So we'll go towards the end of the file. Again, Postfix uses lazy evaluation. So we'll just enter a comment here for SASL auth. Let's just put it in uppercase, although it isn't an acronym. And we'll specify smtpd SASL auth enable equals yes. Now let's just search for the SMTPD, the other directive that we're interested in, the recipient restrictions. We'll search a document for it, and we see references to it, but we don't yet see the directive defined. Now the search is wrapped, meaning it's not defined. So the policy that we saw was just a default policy. So we'll now need to define a policy which mimics what we saw by running the postconf command. So we'll do so using smtpd recipient policy. This is a recipient restriction, and we'll set it to permit, and this is all without spaces, permit my networks, permit SASL authenticated. This one you haven't seen unless you've worked with Postfix outside of this product. And finally, we'll place a reject on auth. So if you're not authenticated, then we'll reject you from relaying to various recipients, unless of course it's a recipient that we host, one of the domains for which we host. So on one line we'll have permit my networks. If you're attempting to relay to a recipient from a network that matches my networks, which if we have it tightly controlled will be only the local host, then you're permitted to send to any recipient. If you also authenticate using SASL, then you'll be permitted. However, otherwise you'll be rejected. Let's save the changes. And at this stage, what we can do is just actually restart Postfix. So let's execute a Postfix start. We'll tail var log mail for any indication of errors or problems. Here's the date. We can ignore the NIS domain, that isn't important. So far so good. This looks pretty good. A connection was lost for an ELO, which we created to query the system. No problem. So this looks pretty good. At 8:51 we restarted the daemon. Now we need to confirm before connecting to the client and attempting to relay a message using SMTPD auth that auth is actually supported. So in a separate shell, Control-Shift-N will telnet into the local host to port 25. We'll send an elo command which announces us as being from the local host. And notice that auth is now a configured option that's supported by Postfix, and it's supported with all of the various authentication mechanisms, including Kerberos 5, CramMD5, DigestMD5, login, and plain. So now we know that our postfix is properly configured. Now let's just double check the SASL setup. SASL places itself in user lib SASL2, and in here we need to ensure that we have a file called smtp.conf. This is the file that our system will read. So we'll need to create this file. We'll simply use nano and we'll create it as smtpd.conf. Now this file that we're creating, if you're interested, is important because this is what the SASL daemon, the auth daemon provided by the Cirrus library, the Cirrus package, will use for authenticating requests from Postfix. If you're with us from the sendmail section, you'll recall that in the sendmail section we had a file called sendmail.conf with a capital S. In here we'll place two directives. The first one is a password check, and we'll perform the password check method. We'll instruct SASL or Cirrus SASL of how to perform the password check, and we'll simply use SASL auth-d, and that's the daemon that'll be running. That'll consult our local password and shadow files, and we can optionally specify the various mechanisms that are supported. So we'll specify that using mechlist. This is optional. Plain and login, considering that we're using clients that are only capable of plain and login. If you have clients that are capable of the other mechanisms, by all means specify them. Now that we have this file smtpd.conf, let's just take a look at that. We should now start the SASL daemon. Now there's an RC script, a startup script already in place on a SUSE Enterprise system for the Cirrus package, which is part of the beauty of installing RPMs or package-based applications. So if we simply execute RC SASL auth-d and start it, it'll start. And it's now running. A PSAX grep of SASL indicates that SASL auth-d has a few instances or many instances launched, and it's using PAM for authentication, pluggable authentication modules. So now that this is up and running, we can actually attempt to authenticate from the client. So let's go to the Outlook Express client. We have it open. We'll just go to Tools, Accounts, to confirm the settings. Currently we don't have SMTP authentication turned on, so let's turn it on. The default is to use the same settings as the incoming server. Now we currently don't have an incoming server configured, so let's log on using a legitimate account on a remote system. A legitimate account would be Linux CBT SUSE1 with the password of ABC123, albeit a weak password, and since we are using login authentication, the password is susceptible to a sniff. Now let's attempt to relay a message. We'll send a message to Linux CBT SUSE1 at Linux CBT work1.linuxcbt.internal, and this will simply say testing SMTP auth. Now this is just an Outlook error. It came up once. We'll try to send and receive again. And while it's trying, let's just ensure that on our local system a netstat ANT of port 25 shows that Postfix is listening on 25, and it is. Let's go back to the Windows client, and it's giving a socket error attempting, in fact it's attempting to connect to the wrong server, which is why it's giving an error. So let's go back to Accounts, and under the server section this should be set to Linux CBT SUSE serve1.linuxcbt.internal. It was actually pointing to the wrong server. Let's try that again. And now it prompts us for the password, so we need to ensure that we have the proper password. And we'll check our local setup. Let's just tail var log mail. And as you can see, it says auth unknown. It gave an error, problem authenticating. What we'll do here is just execute a postfix stop, and we'll restart postfix, and we'll just ensure that SASL is running, and it is. Let's try to relay again using auth, and this time the message sent. So all we had to do is actually restart postfix, since we started the SASL Cirrus daemon after postfix. Now, of course, we get a POP3 error, but that's besides the point. Let's re-examine the logs. And it was accepted. So we're able to connect and relay messages using smtp auth. And what you see echoed in the log file is the username that was used, the method login, which is what's used by Outlook Express. And we were permitted to relay messages. Now let's try to relay a message to the internet. We'll send it to linuxcbt suzy1 at linuxcomputerbasetraining.com. We'll say testing smtp auth, and this too has been sent. So it's gone. If we examine the log files, you'll see that the message was sent. It was delivered out to the internet to linuxcomputerbasetraining.com. So currently we have smtp auth up and running with various mechanisms supported by postfix, which you can confirm by simply telnetting the port 25, sending an ELO, and it returns the different mechanisms, which means any client that you have or will anticipate actually connecting to your postfix instance can use one of these mechanisms. However, we did restrict our smtpd.conf file in the userlib SASL2 directory. Let's cat it to only use the two mechanisms specified. So if you want to use additional mechanisms, then specify them in this file. So smtpd is configured, or our smtp daemon is configured for authentication. It's up and running, and that's how you implement it using postfix. It provides another way of controlling relaying through your server, thus increasing the security of your server, since IPs are subject to change. For example, you may at one point in time permit a given IP address to relay off your server because an executive or a remote user is tied or was tied to the IP address, but if that IP address changes, then the new owner of that IP address will be able to relay off your servers, whether they know it or not. Whereas with SMTP auth, it's tied to a username and password combination to permit it. Now we're going to be looking at other ways we can tighten up and use our postfix MTA throughout the postfix edition.